This is a little story about a air flight gone awry back in August of 1987, landing in a cornfield in the Midwest. One summer I enrolled in an International Development Certificate program at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. After I completed the month-long course, I caught an Air Midwest flight back to Atlanta via Chicago. There were no direct flights. Air Midwest was a regional Delta carrier and flew mostly twin-engine turboprop planes. I was the only passenger as we departed for our first leg to Chicago. I went to the back of the plane where there were 3 seats together and lay across them. I fell asleep before we even started to taxi. The flight gate to gate was usually less than an hour. A sense of something not quite right awakened me. I looked at my watch and realized we'd only been in the air for less than 20 minutes. Out the window, I saw we were descending very rapidly into a sea of green cornfields as far as the eye could see. No sign of an airport anywhere. The pilot came on the intercom and said, "Buckle your seatbelts and tuck your head between your knees. We are making an emergency landing." I tried to comply, but I was so nervous my head kept bopping up and down and around like a jack-in-the-box. Suddenly we bounced hard. I popped my head back up to see the wings clipping the corn as we sped by at a high rate of speed. The pilot braked, and I was pitched forward as the screaming brakes finally brought us to an abrupt stop in a cloud of dust and shattered corn stalks. I looked back out and could see a pole with a night watchman light and a rotary telephone on it. I realized we had landed on some farmer's poorly maintained private asphalt airstrip, and the corn was planted right up to the edge of the tarmac and no road was visible. Everything was suddenly quiet as the engines came to a full stop. After several minutes of silence, the co-pilot pulled the curtain, partitioning the cockpit off to one side. The plane had a small emergency ladder and he dropped it to the ground. He picked up the handset and made a call. He engaged in a highly animated conversation, and after a few minutes he returned to the cockpit and drew the curtain closed. No one said a word to me. I kept waiting, soaking wet from the combination of adrenaline and heat. After a few minutes passed, I made my way to the front. I gingerly moved the curtain to the side and peeked into the cockpit. The pilot and the co-pilot were clearly asleep, a small battery fan oscillating between them. I cleared my throat, no reaction. Finally I said, "Excuse me, what's going on?" The co-pilot barely cracked his eyes and said, "Broke down. I called a mechanic out of Chicago. He should be here within the hour." He closed his eyes again, and I thought, what the hell? My voice slightly elevated, annoyed by his lack of responsiveness. I said, "It's hot as hell back here. Is it okay if I get off?" With a somewhat vexed sigh, he said, "Suit yourself," never opening his eyes. I climbed down the ladder, looked around. Nothing but corn in the sweltering August afternoon heat and unbearable humidity. Not the slightest hint of a breeze in sight. I realized the only shade was under the wing. I climbed back up the ladder and retrieved my hard leather briefcase. I placed it under the wing and used it for a seat. After some period of time, I heard the put of a small engine. Looking up, I saw a single engine Piper Club slowly drifting down to the runway. It landed and leisurely taxied up to park behind our plane. The pilot got out wearing greasy gray overalls and pulled a large toolbox from behind the seat. He set the box on the tarmac and went in the plane without saying a word. After a few minutes, he came back out, picked up the toolbox, walked over to the wing I was under. Still silent, he gave a hint of a nod and then opened the engine cowl and started to work. A little over half an hour passed and he closed the cow, put his tools away, went back in with the pilots. Shortly he returned to his plane and put, took off flying slowly out of sight. I sat there in the silence for a good while and nobody told me anything. Finally I climbed the ladder and looked into the cockpit, and there were both pilots knocked out again. Shook the co-pilot's shoulder. He slowly opened his eyes and I turned my palms up in an inquisitive shrug. As he slowly closed his eyes again, the only thing he said was, "Wrong part." I shook my head mystified and returned to my improvised perch under the wing. Something over another hour and a half passed when I heard the sound of the returning Piper Club. This time the pilot mechanic went straight to the engine, saying nothing. He dropped the cow and went to work, and in less than 15 minutes buttoned it back up. Packing up his tools, he rapped on the fuselage a couple of times with his closed fist. The pilot looked down and the mechanic gave him the thumbs up. As the mechanic flew off, the co-pilot came around to the door and gestured for me to get back on the plane. He watched as I returned to the back seats, and we took off again with him never saying another word. In fact, the pilot had never even acknowledged my existence. We were on the ground for more than 5 hours. And by the time we got to O'Hare Airport, I had missed my flight to Atlanta and no more were available. I found a room at the airport hotel and collapsed without eating. I was exhausted and angry. Delta had not even offered a voucher. When I got back to Atlanta, I filed a claim. Unfortunately, within a matter of weeks, Air Midwest bellied up in bankruptcy. I then filed a complaint with Delta, but they took the position that they had no liability and refused to pay. I never received any compensation. Now for page 2 and the rest of the story. About 6 months later, I booked a Delta connection flight, and as I got on the Embraer plane, I had a odd sense of deja vu. I went back to the back of the plane where I usually sat, and I noticed that the seat pocket in front of me was torn like the one on my previous trip. I opened the pocket and took out the safety card. It was logoed Air Midwest. Lo and behold, it was the exact same plane, just a different airline and a different crew. When we landed, I asked the pilot how long he'd been flying this plane. He answered just a few months. It turned out that Delta had acquired all of Air Midwest's equipment in the bankruptcy. I stood there speechless, shook my head, and departed the plane. I'm sure he probably thought I was quite a bit off in my head, but hey, that's the way it was. Thank you.